Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I've posted over 100 excerpts from some of my more than 250 American montage shows that I did in the 1980s and 90s while at UPI Radio. Recently, I embarked on a fresh series of shows, and here's the first half of one of my new American Montage interviews. My guest this time around is Max Armstrong, who joins us from his studio in Chicago. You know, many of the people I have interviewed on American Montage were people in the media I used to listen to. Max used to listen to me. That's because I'm older than he is, and we both grew up in the same part of the Midwest.
Yeah, Dennis, I grew up in that area of southwestern Indiana, not far from the hometown of Red Skelton there at Vincennes, Indiana, but I grew up near Princeton, Indiana, and started working radio when I was in high school. I just loved it so much and have enjoyed it. I feel like I've been richly blessed over the years to spend this much time in the industry.
Doesn't it seem that everybody you and I know, or have heard about, who lasted in radio knew maybe even in junior high school that that's what they wanted to do?
You know, that's an interesting point, and I make it often. I'm serious about this. I wanted to be on the radio when I was about 7. Growing up in that old farmhouse in southern Indiana, I knew that as I listened to those stations at night, those signals coming in from Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, from Minneapolis, the Class 1A Clear Channel, big signal stations booming in, that I wanted to be on the radio. And then I wanted to be on the radio in Chicago. So to have been able to have done it all these years, I just feel so fortunate. But I would sit in the closet of that old farmhouse and practice radio. I would pick up the newspaper, the Evansville, Indiana Courier, and I'd read the front page as if I were on the radio. And then I'd practice looking up as if I were looking up at the camera, reading a couple of lines ahead, playing to the camera. I know that old farmer and his wife had to be concerned about their grade school boy, wondering what in the world was happening to him.
Max, you remind me a lot of Ed McMahon, who told me several times in interviews that when he was growing up, and I got the impression he spent more time with his grandparents than he did with his parents, that he would get a flashlight and pretend it was a microphone and walk around the parlor. This was back when homes had parlors. And pretend that he was on the radio. That's how he first did it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I did a lot of pretending radio, there's no doubt. And when I first had the opportunity to really see a radio station, I was mesmerized. I was in 6th grade, and our teacher had arranged for 3 of us boys who were interested, she thought, in electronics and communication to go to the local station and to have a tour and to see those turntables spinning, to see the meters moving on the control board, to see the lights flashing back on the transmitters behind that window. It was just stunning. And you know what? To this day, I still love going to radio stations.
Well, you know, the thing about that is, and I guess every generation thinks the next generation is going into a big black hole somewhere, but when you and I were starting, there were those turntables. I mean, you could play an album in some parts of the day, but if you had a prime time shift, if you had to get up and use the bathroom, this one turntable wouldn't switch to the other. You had to be back. And a lot of the music back when I was first starting in radio didn't last 2 minutes.
You're right. All of those songs, it seems, were short for airplay. 2 minutes, 20 seconds, 2 minutes, 40 seconds. I had a friend, though. Now, I was told about this, that when he was working at the radio station, he wanted to slip down to the Dairy Queen to get a sundae. So he tracked an album. And, of course, just as you would expect,
it got stuck.
It hung up. It got hung up and was repeating that passage, repeating it over and over.
Well, you know, a lot of people who haven't thought to think about this and don't really have the basis to because they're used to CDs, which themselves will get messed up.
Right.
The thought that the reason network radio wouldn't delay a broadcast before magnetic tape is even though the sound quality on records they made, and they actually had a machine called a lathe cutter with a needle that scratched an original, is the fact that these primetime shows, if they got stuck, they were dead.
Absolutely.
And so they would do the show twice, once for the East Coast and once for the West Coast.
Very interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Now, when I got to WGN Radio, I started there at the age of 24 at WGN in Chicago. They were still cutting records, but they were doing it for one particular reason and one particular person. The legendary morning man, Wally Phillips, wanted to be able to talk into his commercials. He wanted to be able to lead to that voice, the first voice you heard on that next 60-second spot coming up. So instead of having those on cartridge tape, as was the routine of the day when I got to the station, they would cut those on discs, and the union record turner sitting across the desk, yeah, he was a record turner, union turner, he would sit across that desk, and when he queued up that next commercial, he would write the first 5 or 6 words on a piece of paper and slip it right in front of Wally. But because of that routine, for years they were cutting their own discs of every commercial carried on the station.
Well, you know, many of the shows that are preserved from the golden days of radio that we don't have because Armed Forces Radio put them on these floppy little discs during World War II called V-discs, Victory Discs, to send out to the troops, were only recorded for the sponsors. And the great show, which I've only discovered the last 4 or 5 years, Fibber McGee and Molly, which ran 27 years or so on radio, was sponsored through most of that run by Johnson's Wax. And Johnson's Wax had a copy, which those copies almost got thrown out. But if the sponsor of many of these shows hadn't recorded them, 99% of what happened in the golden days of radio would have gone into the ether, and we would have had no recording of it.
I had never realized that.
Yeah.
You know, what is also interesting, Dennis, is yes, how much of the broadcast history we have lost over the years simply because the stuff went to the dumpster. I know I rescued some things out of the radio station trash cans on tours around the station after signing it off, but you just think of everything that went out the door that we wish we could get back.
Well, I remember I was not working in radio yet, November 22nd, 63, when John Kennedy was shot. But I went down to the radio station that night, and they had thrown the bulletin away in the wastebasket. And I still have it. And for some reason, when things happen in real time, you don't see a value. I mean, all the early announcers I worked with in southern Indiana, of which I have legendary stories, I have no tape of them because at the time it didn't seem important to record what we were doing.
No, you're exactly right. I think back, and when I was, in all of the years I was in Chicago, there was a tape rolling all the time, or the disc was recording it in later years. I mean, everything was being captured, but not everything was retained, as you pointed out. And
yeah.
I just keep kicking myself. In fact, I do know the widow of one of our longtime announcers, and one of these days, when the situation is right, I want to approach her and say, do you happen to have any of his tapes around yet? Because I'd love to capture some.
Yeah, you hate to go into a situation like that. You seem like a vulture almost, you know. Can you go through the closet with me?
I think some of that is probably deserved simply because of people in the industry we've known, Dennis. But
yes.
Yeah, you know, I just don't want to see it get away from us.
Now, the other thing, too, is you wanted to work in Chicago. I wanted to work in D.C. only because I had aunts and uncles there, and we used to go there 2 or 3 times a year, even when I was a child. But people today who listen to FM don't realize that at night, and the situation is diminishing because of changes in the rules and interference in the atmosphere, the government would allow a select number of AM stations to broadcast 50,000 watts and have no other radio station on the air on those frequencies at night. And that's so, I was told that in the 30s, people who lived in podunk parts of the world whose local station was not a network affiliate would be able to hear the news and hear the comedy shows. But I listened to WGN in Chicago. I listened to WLS. You mentioned Minneapolis, WCCO. I would listen to KDKA in Pittsburgh and WSB in Atlanta and WWL in New Orleans. And maybe like you, that's how I got hooked on radio.
Precisely. I listening to what was going on in those faraway cities was just magical to me. You know, I could listen to what, the pregame of the Cubs baseball game, for example, to hear about those players that I talked about all the time, as we were going down to the Little League game. I could hear about Lakeshore Drive in Chicago and just, was mesmerized by all that was happening in the big city, and then really, really felt so blessed, as I'm sure you did, to be in a place where there was so much history and then to be able to talk about everything that was going on there, just as you did when you got to the nation's capital.
Yeah, and I remember I listened to WWL in New Orleans at night, which was a very, very professional, if not old-style station. They were in the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans, and they even broadcast 2 hours from 2 of the lounges at night. There was Leon Kellner, his piano and orchestra, and that type of thing, which they would now and then record with savings bond spots in them, and CBS would run them, but they carried the Mardi Gras. And back then, you could take a microphone on the street and not be afraid of what people would say. So here I am in third grade, and we're studying geography, and we get to New Orleans, and I was a loud child. And I remember kind of yelling out to the nun, "Hey, mister, throw me something." And she said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, that's from the parades and the Mardi Gras." And she said, "How do you know about the Mardi Gras? Did you ever live in New Orleans?" I said, "No, I listened to New Orleans on radio at night." And it did, for us in that generation, give us a much broader concept of what was going on around the country.
You know, I got to WGN and I went to work there with a guy by the name of Carl Grayson.
Oh, Lord.
And Carl, when I found out that he had been in the studio the night of the War of the Worlds broadcast, I was just mesmerized, truly, you know, with just being around him. And we had the opportunity to have a few beverages, you know, and I was a 24-year-old kid sitting there just listening to every word. But as a student, he was sitting on the couch in that studio for the War of the Worlds broadcast. And then when I got to work with him and listen to how he delivered copy, you know, and when I was in college, they talked a lot about oral interpretation, you know, really making that script come alive. I never really realized what it was until I worked with Carl, and you could visualize, truly visualize everything he described in a 60-second piece of copy or even in a longer piece. He was so good at putting the right emphasis and giving you the feeling and making you see it as he read it.
Max, how often have people said to you, are you on radio or something? Because whenever I address a Kiwanis Club or whatever, I like to tell them that, yes, I have a very artificial way of speaking. If I had stayed in southern Indiana and sold shoes for 40 years, I would have kind of a squeaky southern Indiana hillbilly accent. But we both lost that and developed a kind of articulation. But the interesting thing is, when I'm talking to you now, I pause. Not quite like Paul Harvey, but in normal conversation you wouldn't do that. People just slur everything together and say, "Yeah, I pause." And I tell people what you do when you learn to speak is that, as you just said, you use the word, you sell what you're saying. And you sell it with emphasis and inflection that is largely missing now from conversation.
Oh, that's such a wonderful point. Absolutely. Yeah, you know, people do recognize the voice, and it always shocks me. And sometimes it gets to be a little bit embarrassing. You know, maybe I'm not so patient, not as patient as I ought to be at the checkout lane or something, and I'm walking away, and somebody will yell, "Max, it's good to see you. I recognize the voice." And my wife has prompted me on numerous occasions that I need to be just a little more careful.
Well, you know, one of the most flattering things that ever happened to me is for 20 years I worked for United Press International's radio network.
Oh, I know that well.
And we were kind of the stepsister of the networks, but we were cranking out 24 newscasts a day and 18 half-hourlies and sportscasts and businesscasts. But they were running mostly on small stations, and if our content ran on big stations, and we would send out every hour a package of sound cuts. For example, we were headquartered in D.C. If there had been a fire, say, in Seattle, I might call the fire chief of Seattle on the phone and get these clips. "Oh, it's horrible here." You know. Then we would clean them up so they were just the important part of the clip, and we would send them out to the stations, and the stations would run them. Well, for example, WGN might say, "We talked to Fire Chief Joe Doe." They don't say Dennis Daly at United Press International talked to Joe Doe and fed us this information, because they're buying it from UPI. The problem was we were on some of the biggest stations in the country, but we had no identity because they didn't have the words UPI attached to them. Anyway, I'm having supper in Washington, D.C. one day, and this fellow in a very bright military uniform turns to me and says, Are you Dennis Daly? I said, "Yes." He said, "Man, I listen to your news all the time." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, I'm stationed with the military, and Armed Forces Radio uses your newscast because they don't have commercials in them. Armed Forces is forced to cut the commercials out. And UPI just had pauses where you could put in your own commercials." And I said, "Where are you?" He said, "Oh, I'm in Tokyo." And I said, "Well, boy, you must be up late at night." I didn't stop thinking because I was doing a lot of graveyard shifts. He said, No, you're prime time in Tokyo."
Yes.
And I thought, Wow.
I remember, of course, I used your cuts. I was at WASK in Lafayette, Indiana, but I was in college, and you were there on the UPI audio with Pi Chamberlain and Gene Gibbons and Bonnie Bay. See, I remember the names. I haven't forgotten, Dennis.
We had a great crew.
Absolutely. My voice is heard way back in the background on one of the episodes of NCIS. From the very first season, I believe it was the 8th episode, and I think that show has been on the air now more than a decade. Well, it replays about 3 times of the year on USA Network. And it's early in the show. Mark Harmon he's fallen asleep under his boat. He gets a telephone call, and in the background, you hear, and soybeans over the past week went up 20 cents a bushel. We'll talk with a grower in Iowa. And I hear from someone in America, somewhere in this country, some old friend, every time it runs, even though it's not at all in the foreground, it's very much in the background. But it speaks to what you were saying, Dennis, and how fortunate we've been to be invited into homes and cars and pickup trucks, and to be able to inject some of ourselves into the lives of folks, to deliver a poignant story, maybe something that causes a person to pause and say, wow, I didn't know that. Or perhaps to bring some humor into their day, to brighten their day a bit, and maybe cause them to chuckle. And isn't that a neat opportunity we've had?
I was very lucky. I went to Indiana University, which had a great broadcast school, and the first summer I was there, the great Norman Corwin, who only passed away recently, guest taught one summer. So I got to know Norman back in '68, and we remained casual friends over the years. But I remember in one lecture, and here I am 20 years old, and back then, who cares about anything? But he called one of the members of the class up and said, you sit down in front of me. I'm going to read you something from a radio play I wrote. And Corwin is reading it, and he's looking right at that kid. And then he turned to all of us, and he said, that's radio. I'm not talking to all of you. I'm talking to him, but you're listening. And the idea always stuck with me, that you imagine that there's one person on the other side of the microphone, and they have to understand what you're saying. It takes the fear away that you're talking to hundreds of thousands of people, but it also reminds you that, like no other medium, radio is one-on-one.
Precisely. And I've known people, including some program directors of radio stations, who would put a picture up there on the wall or put it over the top of the console somewhere up on the copy board of an individual, of a listener, and then remind the announcers, you're speaking to this one person. You're not talking at them. You're talking with them.
Max, let's talk about some of the people that we crossed paths with or who influenced us growing up. You talk about Carl Grayson. I remember you talk about articulation, but there's a fine line between being articulate and sounding as if you're on radio like this. There's you want to, and you and I both pronounce nearly every consonant. You probably say duct tape and put both T's in there. But I listened to Grayson, and of course the Meister Browse Showcase on WGN at night with Franklin McCormick, who had every woman in the eastern part of the U.S. drooling over him, I think. You talk about smooth. He was as smooth as the beer that sponsored him.
You have to remember that voice was coming through the night, and when people, and especially in the middle of the night, Dennis, people were alone. Some of them were lonely. But I distinctly remember when I got to WGN in Chicago, the security guards telling me stories about women who would try to get in, try to run past the door, try to get upstairs to see Mr. McCormick.
And he was just an average-looking guy.
He was. And we have some wonderful air check tapes, including one when he was in the midst of a Meister Brau commercial. He developed a terrible case of hiccups.
Oh, Lord.
A very, very untimely case of hiccups, so that as he's delivering the spot, he's hiccuping his way through it.
Now, you and I both probably grew up listening to the 500-mile race because in Indiana, next to basketball, it's a religion. The late Sid Collins, who coined the phrase, now stay tuned for the greatest spectacle in racing. I worship the ground that man walked on.
I did too. There was nothing like that broadcast every Memorial Day. And part of it was the quality of the announcers all around the track too, and the way they would hand it off from one to another. I mean, these were very early days by comparison, very early days of radio when you compare it to today. But, Johnny DeCamp would be there and some of the others who were local announcers in Indianapolis at then WIBC, I think, was where you found many of them.
But years later, when it evolved, it's interesting to note that all of these announcers, Howdy Bell, Mike Ahern, Bob Jenkins, these people came from different Indianapolis TV stations, but on race day, they dropped all of their individual loyalties and worked together because of the importance to the city of Indianapolis.
You're exactly right. In fact, we just lost one of those gentlemen in the past year, Mr. Carmichael, you may recall.
Yes.
I'm sorry,
yeah.
Carnegie, Tom Carnegie.
Tom
Carnegie passed, and he continued in recent years to be the voice, the PA announcer out of the track. Well, he was a long-time newsman, of course, a long-time broadcaster there, but the old WFBM stations, which, of course, long ago changed their call signs. One other thing I recall vividly from the days of our youth, and I was so impressed by it, and some of this tied in with sports in Indiana, the fact that we didn't have the class system in tournament basketball. No. So little old New Harmony, with maybe 70 students in the high school, could go up against East Chicago Roosevelt. And it really harkens back to the Hoosiers era. And
the movie
absolutely.
Hoosiers, yes. Yeah.
And you would go to one of those tournaments. I distinctly remember being at a regional tournament in Evansville, Indiana, and there were 15 radio stations. Every station, every town was there with their phone line, their banner hanging out on the front of the press box, and there were so many they filled the press box, and there would be others down along the floor. And when it came state tournament time, oh my goodness, that weekend...
They had to assign a special person at Indiana Bell Telephone just to handle that.
That's right.
Yeah.
And as you tuned across the band, when that basketball tournament was being played, every radio station you could pick up. Now, there was a little bit of a difference there because if you were close to the state line, you might pick up some of the Illinois stations or Kentucky stations, but every Indiana station I would hit dialing down through there, they were carrying the tournament from Indianapolis, and not over a network. It was with their own darn crew they sent there.
Absolutely. And in the heyday of the 500, when they had something like 1,500 radio stations carrying it, you could tune across the band in Indiana and not miss a word.
That's right.
Every radio station was carrying that race. And I'll tell you how I found out Sid died. And it was only later, we found out that he took his own life. I don't know whether you heard the story, but on the first day of race month, his doctor said, "Sid, you won't live until the race." And he did the sports that night on Channel 6 and then said goodbye. I was working news in Washington, D.C. on an all-news station, and we had a little box called the Dumb Box. And the Dumb Box was nothing but a shoe box that people would throw little extra feature stories in, and if you needed to fill time, you'd grab something. And a lot of people, again, don't realize that if you're joining CBS or NBC or whatever at the top of the hour, they don't wait for you. You have to have your clock set with New York and shut up in time to hear them. Well, my commercial ran short, and I've got about 30 seconds left, and I reach into this box, and I'm reading on the air, never having seen it before. Sid Collins, the longtime voice of the Indianapolis 500, is dead. And my heart sank. I mean, I can remember that moment. I remember what the studio looked like. It hit me like a ton of bricks, and I almost started crying on the air. Because those people, and I don't know whether people still have those kind of media heroes, but they seem so good and so pure, if I may use that word, that they became a part of our lives.
You're exactly right. I think we probably glossed over a little bit. I mean, we maybe glamorized their existence perhaps a little more than was deserved, as we later found that, yes, these people, my goodness, after all, were human.
They go to the bathroom. They've had divorces.
Absolutely. They put on their pants as the way we did. But, the thing that comes to mind, Dennis, is I think how richly blessed you and I were to be able to hang out at radio stations. While today young people have all kinds of media opportunities, I mean, they can do a broadcast right out on the internet anytime. there isn't as much opportunity to go in a local radio station and find you can help put on the ball game, work a Saturday night. As I did when I was in college, I worked every Saturday night. And you know what? I loved it. I'd much rather have been at the station than going to some party on campus. I was having my own party. I was the guy on the air out there with the doors all locked up, running 2 radio stations in that building. I was the voice coming through the radios at the party at times, you know?
Sure.
But is there that opportunity anymore?
No, and I remember one Saturday afternoon, I must have been 19, and the radio station was on the 3rd floor of the Knights of Columbus building. And I'm up there playing records on a Saturday afternoon. I look down and I see my friends driving around, and one went past in a convertible, and I can't even tell you on radio what was going on inside that car. And I thought, why aren't I down there? And I said, wait a minute, Dennis. I have the biggest record player in the world up here.
That's right.
In stereo, with huge speakers. And we had record libraries back then, because the record company sent you everything that covered walls and walls in these buildings. Let me mention somebody else here, and it's inevitable, you being in Chicago, and that's Paul Harvey. There again, the day he died, I think a lot of radio went with him. Living in Chicago, first of all, what were your earliest memories of Paul Harvey, and how did it feel like to be, if not a comrade, at least a colleague of his in Chicago?
Well, where do I start, Dennis? I felt so privileged to know Paul and to have on 4 occasions been quoted by Paul. And, you know, just the fact that he did it, but then you would hear from people. A neighbor of mine was assigned to work at and this is a very similar experience, I'm sure, to what you went through. A neighbor of mine was working on a hydroelectric project in South Korea. And every morning he and his colleagues would sit outside the gate of that plant and they would listen to Paul Harvey on Armed Forces Radio. Well, on one particular day after some trip that I had covered, an agriculture trip, and I'd come back talking about what was going on in the old Soviet Union, Paul quoted me, having heard me on WGN Chicago, quoted me in one of his newscasts. And my neighbor, when he came back, when he was furloughed home a few weeks later, came running up the front door screaming, saying, I heard you mentioned by Paul Harvey.
The second half of this interview is also posted here on YouTube. I'm Dennis Daly.